Good morning. I want to start this video by talking about Chapter 2, Part 2. And that is all about working with DAX, or Data Analysis Expressions, inside the data model of Excel. So I want to take a second and just quickly review what we talked about last week as we work with that data model, that underlying system within Excel. So here's what we've learned. So in the newer versions of Excel, 2016 and above, you got the PowerPivot add-in. And PowerPivot has actually been around for quite some time, but it has only recently been included with Microsoft Office Pro Plus from 2016 and beyond. So now what does PowerPivot do for you? Well, it does a lot. So really what it is it's an underlying data model, or a columnar database that you can then use to build a model and then create pivot tables and visualizations off that model. So in many ways, it incorporates some of the aspects that you would have seen in a SQL Server reporting services, and it brings those over into Excel. It's a really, really powerful tool, and there's a lot of reasons and benefits to doing that. For example, overcoming the row size, or the number of total rows that you can have in Excel, right? So if I jump into my worksheet here, I skip to the end, that is the maximum amount of rows that I can have in an Excel workbook. That being said, though, when you're working in big data, you may very well have more rows than that. So now we learned a lot about the PQE, the Power Query Editor, and what that PQE can do for you, right? It allows you to shape data sources. It allows you to import data sources if you wanted to, or to create connections in which you can model off of and then create a final project. Now, the PQE, in my opinion, is a better way of connecting to data sources and shaping them and adding them to the data model. However, when you do work with PowerPivot, you have the ability to directly connect or pull in files from inside PowerPivot, which also is called the data model, okay, which is also called the data model. I'm waiting for that quick thing to pop up here, but you'll see us as we go back and forth between there, okay? So you'll see in here, so we're inside the data model, that you have the ability to get external data. I'm going to close here. I'm going to go back into regular old Excel for a second. And you'll see that when we connect to data, we have that same amount, over that same similar features here inside the data tab of Excel. So there's two different places that you can pull data in. Now, if you were to ask me, though, just personal preference, I would actually prefer to pull it this way using the PQE versus using PowerPivot, the data model method of using it, because I don't have as many advanced data shaping features pulling into the model. So you have to have a cleaner data source if you go directly into the model. Now I'll show you both of those just so you can get a good feel for how that works. Before we even do that, let's just talk about PowerPivot in general. Now, we discussed this a little bit in class last week, but I want to point out to you that PowerPivot is indeed an add-in in Excel. So because it's an add-in in Excel, you actually have to turn it on before you can do anything else. And by default, it's not there. And also, you can only do this if you have Microsoft Office Professional Pro Plus. So I'm going to go backstage. I'm going to go down to Options. From Options, I'm going to go to Add-ins. And from Add-ins, I'm going to go to COM Add-ins and click Go. From here, that's where all of your Power add-ins will live. These are the same kind of things that you would see inside Power BI. They're just part of it. So if you were to take these three things away from Excel and take that data model away from Excel, put it in its own thing, you're going to get Power BI, which is actually pretty sweet. Okay, so now I've got these things all turned on. You may not have them turned on, so you're going to want to go ahead and do that. Click OK. Now here's what we're going to do that is totally different from what you would do if you were working in regular old Excel. I'm never going to actually put any data in my worksheet at all. I'm not going to directly connect to anything in my worksheet at all. I'm going to work fully in the data model. See it? Data model manage. Now, before we do that, let's just look at the files we're working on today. So you guys are probably familiar with the movie database that we've used in class a few times, right? So starting in 265, working our way through 378, we built the equivalent of a red box database, right? So we have a database that's got transactional information from a red box kiosk, okay? That database is here. We've got a CSV file. Actually, this may be a tab delimited file. that has all of our movie records in it, right? So we've got that there. And we've got an XML file that has all of our contact information in it. So we've got three different data sources that we're going to splice together into the data model. We're going to create a connection to it, and then we're going to actually start creating analysis off of those, or data analysis expressions. So we're going to use DAX to create some analytics calculations, okay? So we've got those three files that we're going to pull in. Those three files will be available for you on the Teams group meetup. Okay, we're going to splice those things together. I'm going to show you the two different ways that you can pull those into the data model, and then we're going to do some expressions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into PowerPivot, and you'll notice we have a data model section here that says manage. Okay, now one thing that's confusing for people, which is not uncommon for Excel, is the redundancy that's built into Excel. So the same data model that you have right here is actually this same data model there. See it? So just to make it even more confusing, instead of calling it the data model here, they call it the PowerPivot window, which is the data model. So now you can get to it from here. You can get to it from here. But either way, whichever one I click, it's going to take me to the exact same place. So here I am inside the data model. Now notice it's totally blank. There's nothing else in here. Also notice that it sort of looks like Excel, but it's not. So before we push forward, there is one thing I want to show you. Notice I've got a tab here that's called Advanced. This tab, see where I've got switch to normal mode? By default, when you get in here, that tab may not be there. It'll say Home or Design. But we actually need that Advanced tab because that shows us the ability, or that'll show us our implicit and explicit measures. So we need to go to File, and we need to switch to Advanced mode and make sure that's on, because eventually we're going to go in here and we are going to want to see our implicit measures, which I realize you don't know what that is yet, but you will within the next 10 minutes or so. All right. So the first thing is we don't actually have any data in our data model at all. There's nothing here. Now, you know, with PQE, you can pull files from multiple sources. You can shape those files. You can either connect to them or you can add them to an Excel table, pivot table, or just straight up into the workbook. You can do something somewhat similar inside the data model of PowerPivot, but not nearly as powerful as PQE. So I want to show you how to connect to a database using PowerPivot, but I also am going to go into the PQE and connect the other way to show you how to connect from that PQE, maybe shape data a little bit, and then pull that into Excel. Excuse me, into the data model. So what I'm going to do is I am going to connect from another source. And from that other source, let's go down and let's say we want to connect. Actually, let's not do another source. Let's do the database first. We're going to connect to the database, and we're going to go from access. And in the previous class last week, I showed you how to connect using SQL Server. Okay, the same process, except with access, it's always running localhost, so it knows it's connecting to access. I'm going to click Browse, and there are my two databases. So I'm going to click Transactions Beta, click Open, and I'm going to click Next. And it's going to ask me how I want to pull. Do I want to write a query, right? So I can write an SQL query to specifically pull data, or do I want to just pull an entire data table from the database? We're just going to pull a table from the database. There's only one table in it. That's it. We're going to click Transact, or actually, let's click Finish, and we'll just go ahead and pull that in. All right. So when we click Close here, now all of a sudden, you have data in your data model. So let's talk about what this is. This is not Excel, okay? So you can't work in here the way you work in Excel. Notice you don't have column letters. You do have row numbers. You've just got column names. You've got this thing floating around down here. That's the calculation area, which you can toggle on and off, right? So from the Home tab, we'll go over here, toggle on, toggle off. Trust me, you're going to want to leave. Sorry, I clicked the wrong thing there. Data view. Calculation area on. You're going to want to leave that on. You don't want to leave that off because this is where we're going to write our DAX. Okay, think of it like our workspace. So I want to leave that on. So first things first, you have what appears to be a worksheet tab. That's basically one set of data that's been added to the data model. And every time we add an additional set of data, you're going to see a new tab appear inside the data model indicating that that's a new set of data that we've added in. So now here's what I'm going to do different. I'm going to exit the data model. I'm going to go back into Excel. And now that I'm in Excel, if I pull up queries and connections, I've actually got this connection in the data model, right? So I've got the data model and I've got that connection that I just created. So now here's what I'm going to do different. So I've got two more files to pull in. I've got an XML file and I've got a CSV file to connect to, okay? So instead of using the data model to directly pull it in, I'm going to use the PQE, the Power Query Editor, to pull the data in just to show you the difference. Now in the end, they will both end up inside the data model. Either way. But the reason I want to show you the PQE is because you have so much more advanced features than what you would have if you were using just the the PowerPivot model. So I'm going to go to Data, and just like we did when we worked with PQE before, I'm going to go to from CSV or text, and then I've actually got to browse for my PowerPivot apps folder. And there's my two files. Well, there's my text files that are available. So let's just go ahead and grab our CSV. We're going to click import, but really what it's going to do is it's going to open up the PQE. So here's the PQE. So now my options are, if it looks good, I can directly load this to the data model. But what makes this special is I can actually shape it, which I need to shape it. See how this doesn't look quite right? Using the PQE. So I'm going to click Transform Data and take a look and see what's going on here. So what that does is it opens up the PQE. Here we are. So from here, we've got two issues. First of all, we got duplicates. So we're going to have to get rid of those duplicates. We don't like those. Okay. And then second, this is absolutely wrong. So the cases are all off on this particular file here. So what I'm going to do first is we're going to shape this first column. So we're going to do that by going to transform, and then we're going to go to format, and we'll go to capitalize each word. All right, so we like that. That's good. And you learned how to do that a couple weeks ago. Second thing we need to do is we got to get rid of these duplicates. As you know, you can't have duplicates when you're working in a database in general. And in many ways, we're building a database file that we're going to visualize. So remember, just a quick once over about databases, right? The base element of every database is a table. Tables are comprised of fields. Fields have values, and a group of related field values is a record. Okay. Records are identified by keys, aka the primary key. Every record has to have one, just like you have to have a social security number. And the key aspect of that is that a primary key cannot repeat and a primary key cannot be null, aka blank. We don't like that. Okay. So all these records here, these last 12 records, boom, boom, those are repeating, and that's just a mistake that shouldn't be in there. And it's there to show you when you're using the PQE that you can go in and fix as need be. So let's go in here and we're going to remove rows, and we will remove duplicates. Did we not get it? All right. Well, if we can't remove duplicates, let's do this. We'll remove bottom rows, and when it asks us how many, we'll remove the last 12. And oh, there might have been one more. It might have been 13. No problem. We'll remove one more. Remove the bottom one row. There we go. Duplicates are gone. Okay, so this data looks pretty good so far. And I don't want to spend a lot of time in here because there's a whole different video dedicated to PQE, Power Query Editor. So what I'm going to do is something different. So I'm going to click Close and Load. I'm going to click Close and Load to. And when I do, now it's going to ask me, okay, do you want to put this data in a new worksheet? I don't. I'm going to just create a connection, and then I'm going to add it to the data model. That's what we did differently this time that we wouldn't have done before. So no data is actually being pulled into Excel yet. So if you're working with a big data file, it's not going to bog your computer down yet. You're just creating a connection. You're using that in the data model, right, just to shape your data as you see fit, to build any kind of analytic expressions as you see fit. And then from there, you'll eventually pull that data in and create your pivot table or create your power pivot, whatever you want to do. Excuse me, your pivot chart. So I'm going to click OK. And the first thing you'll see is in Excel, nothing happens. Like, so it looks like you've got basically nothing. But if I go into the model, all of a sudden now I've got a second tab, and that tab has my shaped data. Okay. So now we've got one more to do. There's an XML file as well. So I'm going to go in and pull that XML file. I'm going to go to data. I'm going to go to get other data from other file. We're going to go to XML. There's my XML contacts tab. I'm going to click import. That opens up PQE. I take a peek at it. This actually is pretty good. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to shape this at all. There are some best practices that you would want to do just in general when you're working with PQE. You'll see trim and clean are really common things that you'd want to do. Just make sure there's no extra junk floating around in your files. But for now, I'm going to go to load, and I'm going to go to load 2. I'm going to go only create connection, add this to data model, click OK. Okay, so now if I've done this right, when I go into the Power Pivot, look at the model, all of a sudden, I got 3 tabs. Boom, boom, boom. Now, earlier, I accidentally clicked there we go. Okay, so the next thing you've got here is you've got 3 separate tables of data. But these aren't just separate tables of data. This is actually relational data. And I've got a whole nother video on relational database systems and data warehouses. So if you hear me say relational data and you don't understand what I'm talking about when we go into talking about Snowflake and star schemas here in just a second, go back and check out those videos on data warehouse intro with Power BI, because it's going to talk about COD and the invention of databases. It's going to talk about the Inman method of data warehousing. So go back, check all that stuff out, because that's really, really helpful in understanding conceptually what's happening here. It really will be beneficial to you. So the next thing we have to do before we continue is we actually have to tell PowerPivot that we've got some relational data working here. So now let me just quickly show you what I mean. So this tab, this transactions tab here, this is the data from the database that has all of our transactional information in it. Okay, so every time someone rents a movie, that movie gets recorded here. What gets recorded? The transaction information, the account information, and the serial number information. So basically, transaction has a number. It's got the date that corresponds with it. The account number is the account number of the person that rented the movie, and the serial number is the serial number that identifies the movie. Okay, so think of that like your barcode. So that's all the transactional information gets recorded. By the way, this is actually your fact table that's been pulled in here. So the second table that we pulled in was a table of all of our movies. So basically this is our inventory information, right? All of our inventory information's got what you'd think: movie title, release date, rating, serial numbers, okay? All those things are there. So serial number 1, The Godfather, if I go into transactions, serial number 1 was rented on February 9th, 2011 by 1482. So 1482, if I go to account number, was Abby Brunk, who is a silver member of our movie rental company, right? So all that stuff is related. So this account number is the same as that account number, right? So this column and this column are related. And in movies, the serial number column and the serial number column are related. Now, this works because the data is normalized, and that's also another video for another day. So hopefully if you're at this point in the game where you're talking about taking an advanced certification test, you understand what normalized data is, you understand what star and snowflake schemas are, you understand the concept of setting up relationships, cardinality within data, which we're going to do in just a second. And again, if not, don't fret. 1, you've got the study guide. 2, go back, check out some of the older videos on the YouTube channel. So here's what we need to do here. What I explained to you, you need to explain to your data model. So what I'm going to need to do here is I'm going to go into design, and I need to go in and set up my relationships. Okay, so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to actually add a relationship. See, it says cardinality. So what we're going to do is here we're going to create, and the way this works is when you're working in PowerPivot, when you're working in Power BI, Microsoft pretty much exclusively has adopted the star schema methodology of setting up a database. And there are actually multiple schemas. The star schemas and snowflake schemas are the two most popular methodologies of setting up relational databases. What we're going to do is create a star schema. So a star schema is comprised of two things. You've got fact tables and you've got dimension tables. A fact table holds all of the facts of your transactions, whatever business you're doing. So in its core, the transactions table would be the fact table, right? Because every time someone rents a movie, that actually is being recorded in that table. Dimensions of that fact table would be the serial number in the transaction, or excuse me, in the account number, right? So who rented a movie would be one of the dimensions, and what they rented would be the other dimension. Those are stored in separate tables. Those tables are called dimension tables. And last week, when we looked at the data warehouse for AdventureWorks, you saw dimension and fact tables. Now, just because we understand that doesn't mean that that's actually something that your machine understands until you tell it, right? So, for example, if I want to create a relationship with my fact and dimension table, I've got my transactions table, I've got my movies table, and I'm going to say that the serial number and the serial number are related. So, serial number for transactions, serial number for movies. Click OK, and it's going to evaluate that relationship, and hopefully it's going to tell me, yep, it is a many to one relationship. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, it's really, really simple. With our inventory, right, you've got all these movies. The movie The Godfather with the serial number 1, that can only appear in my inventory table once, right? Because there's only one movie that's got serial table number 1. That being said, how many times can you check out that movie? How many times can someone rent The Godfather? They can rent it as many times as you want. So the cardinality of this relationship is many to one, right? So transaction number 1 can appear in the transactions table many times. But the actual inventory number of 1 in the inventory table can only appear once. So that's a many to one relationship. So we're going to have another one here. We're going to keep that transactions fact table. We're going to jump down to our dimensions again. And this time we're going to go to account. And it's going to be very similar, right? So there can only be one Abby Brunk, right? There's only one Abby Brunk with 1482 in the world, just like there's only one you with your specific serial number, right? But she can rent as many movies as she wants. So this is also a many to one relationship, or you could call it a one to many if we flip these around. So I could go in and up here where it's transactions, I could do movies first. Then I could go down here and do transactions. And it's really the exact same thing. So actually, it wasn't a movie that I wanted, was it? It was account. There we go. So account here. So this would be a one to many relationship. I click OK. And now we've set up the relationships of our data. By the way, if you happen to be taking MS-372 database design, you would have designed this in something called an entity relationship diagram, an ERD, literally physically on paper, before you ever got here. But in the interest of time, we can't do that. So we're going to go and click close. Now when I look at my relationships, those are there. And I've got another little bonus for you. If I go over here to diagram view, boom, it actually will show me my ERD. So there's my ERD. And this is very similar. So you should be familiar with this. And by the way, so we talked about snowflake versus star schema. Let's see if I can move this over so you can see it. This is what makes the star schema. Now that being said, there's only 3 tables, so there's not enough to do to spin it off. But there's my fact table in the middle here. These are my dimension tables. So what would happen is if I had more dimensions, I'd keep adding them out here. They'd all connect to that fact table in the middle, and what you get would be that beautiful little star pattern that you've got there. Now keep this in mind because we're eventually going to go back in and do hierarchies, which are really cool. So let me then go back to data view. All right. So now what makes this additionally more special? So now we touched on PowerPivot a little bit in the last class. So first thing, the benefit of PowerPivot, besides being able to build a data model, is simply that you can have multiple data sources summarized inside one pivot table. If you didn't use the data model feature, if you didn't use this database as part of PowerPivot, you would have multiple worksheets and you'd have to take all the data on each worksheet and put it all in one big old worksheet, and then that could be inside a pivot table. Now the benefit of PowerPivot is this entire data model, if I go in to create a pivot table, I can now model, so we'll go to a new worksheet. I can now model off of these. All of these show up. If this was just regular old pivot table, right? Whatever's on this worksheet would show up here, but I wouldn't have the additional tables. So the first thing is I've got this awesome set of data that I've modeled together and I've shaped it and I've set up the relationships, and I can now literally report right off the bat. So I don't have to do anything else. Okay. So now I'm assuming, which I don't want to make that assumption, but I'm assuming that you know how a regular pivot table works. And I know that's not a fair assumption, because not everybody does. There are different videos on regular pivot tables, but the positive is by the time you get to this point where you are right now, with the exception of this calculation area here, which I'm going to show you in a minute, this is exactly the same as a regular pivot table would work. So you've got filters, you've got columns, rows, and values, you've got calculation settings that are all in there, you've got slicers, global report filters, all that stuff is there. So at this point, I can model as I see fit. So for example, I've got my account information here. So I've got my type. So there's bronze, gold, silver. Then from there, I can put my last names. Those are the last names of the people. They're bronze, gold, silver. And if I'm interested in how many movies they've rented, for example, I could go over here. I'll take the transaction number. I'll pop that there. I'm going to change it from sum to count. And it's going to tell me these are the movies that were rented. If I'm interested in filtering that by date, I can. So I can grab date, pop that in here. Now I can go in and say, well, on these days, this is when the data was created. So that's the basic part. Now what I want to get into are data analysis expressions. And you've actually got one already, right? So see down at the bottom, we've got grand total right there. So that is the pivot table automatically aggregating our data. So it's counting the number of transactions and it's telling you there's 49. Okay. So for basic everyday pivot table users, this is about as far as you could get. Although you know that you can add calculated columns even in regular old pivot tables. So you could add additional expressions to this just using add calculated column if this was a regular pivot table. You have so much more that you can do with DAX and the data model if you're using PowerPivot. So now in order to understand that though, we actually have to go back to the data model and first take a look at this. It's this thing down here. See values? You know that whenever you add something to this square of the pivot table fields, that it performs some kind of calculation. And you know if you go to value field settings, you can use any of these basic aggregate calculations. And that is a sweet spot, right? That is a cool thing that pivot tables do. And you know that it uses filter context. So if I were to filter by a date, it would then adjust and show me just the transactions for that date and actually aggregate those. So if I go in, boop, and let's grab, select multiple, just that one. It just changed that filter context to 1, right? Because on that day, only Emerson Campin rented a movie. If I go in and change it to Doom Doom, there you go. Now you've got 2. Those 2. Okay? So that's one of the benefits here. So if you were to pick up a book on the theory of working with DAX and data modeling, they would say actually what you're doing here isn't the greatest thing. What you're doing here is you're creating an implicit measure. That's what these are. So this calculation is actually called a measure. Okay? Measure. And measures are basically calculations that are some kind of performance indicator of your data, some kind of analysis expression, something that tells you something about your data. And that's important. You'll have a lot of those, right? Those turn into KPIs, right? Key performance indicators. So now what's the difference between an implicit and an explicit measure, and why do we care? Well, let me just go back into the data model and show you. So here I am in the data model, okay? And I created that off of, I believe, the transactions tab. So let's talk about what you see in this data model for a minute. So up here, you've got your actual data. And down here, this is called the calculation area. This is where you do your expressions. You can write different expressions to state different things about your data or to analyze your data. If I go to advanced, I have the option of show implicit measures. And if I click it, ooh, look at that. It shows me these. So let's look at what that means. So right down here, it's created an implicit measure, and that implicit measure is something that is only created automatically within pivot table. So every time I use that value setting inside the pivot table values window, it's going to create an implicit measure. Now, there are some pros and there's some cons to this, but they would actually tell you that you would want to avoid this whenever possible. Okay? So, what are the pros and cons to creating implicit versus explicit measures? Well, first of all, what's the difference between an implicit and an explicit measure? Well, this is an implicit measure. That's what you see here. So you're seeing sum of transactions, transactions table, transactions number. All right, so you're seeing all that. I could actually go right next to this and do, let's pick another space. Let's go down here and write my own expression. Okay. Now, just a quick reminder about this, and you learned this a couple years ago. When you're working with databases in general, not just with Excel, databases don't have A1 style referencing the way that Excel does, right? So when you write a function in Excel, you've got, B6 through B9 or, C2 plus C5. There are no column letters when you're working in DAX, just like there are no column letters when you're working with databases. So when you're writing expressions or any kind of other statements using DAX, you don't use that style of referencing, that A1 style referencing. You use a different kind of style, a different kind of referencing called structured referencing. Okay, so when you work with structured referencing, there's two different types. You've got fully qualified structured referencing and unqualified structured referencing. So what you see here, account, account number, or excuse me, account and account here, or account and first, those are fully qualified structured references. And what it means is it's the account table, first name field, account table, last name field, account table, type field, and the field goes in those square brackets. Now, that's called a fully qualified structured reference because it's telling you the full data object, so that's the table, and the field from the table that you're pulling. Now, here's something that's kind of cool. Notice right here, if I try to select that as an option, it just says date without the name of the object. That's because the date field is actually in the data object that I'm working in right now. So you see I'm on the transactions tab here, and date is part of transactions, so it knows itself. So do you have the ability to write a fully qualified structured reference for this? You can. It's right there. Transactions table date. Do you really need to? Not actually, because you already are working inside that object. So now if you do that, if you just say date field without saying the name of the object, you've got yourself an unqualified structured reference. They both work just fine. Okay? But I really want to make sure you understand that. It's not something that I'm covering in depth right now because you learned it 2-3 years ago as sophomores. But please understand that you do have to use structured referencing with DAX. You can't use A1 style referencing at all. Okay, so A1 style referencing is the default style of Excel. Can't do that. We're not in Excel. We're in PowerPivot. Okay, so I want to stress that. So back to writing my function. Say I just want to know, actually, let's not do sum. Let's do count. Say I want to know the total number of transactions. So I'm going to do a count. And I'm going to do a count of, let's go transaction number. So you know that I can just click transaction here. And it's going to create an explicit measure. See? So it says measure and it says 49. So now everything before the colon is just the default name. So I can take that away and we can say total transactions, like so. And I get 49. Now that's the exact same 49 that I have here, but why do we care? Well, here's why we care. When you create a implicit measure, that implicit measure is only going to be available inside the pivot table that you originally created it in. So if I create a new pivot table right now, so if I create that new pivot table, see down here where it says total transactions, that is the explicit measure that I just created. But what you don't see is the implicit measure that I created before. So if I were to go in and just fiddle with this a little bit, so we'll take we'll go type again. So we're going to recreate that same pivot table that we did before. We take our transaction number and we change it from sum to count. We're about to see the magic of why you don't want to do these or why you want to minimize these. Okay, so this pivot table and that pivot table are exactly the same. Okay, When we created the first pivot table here, we created an implicit measure by setting the value field to count. Okay? So when we did that, it created that implicit measure, but that measure was specific to this pivot table. Okay? So when I created the new pivot table over here, that's the new one. Okay? I have another implicit measure that was created when I set count down here. Okay? So now you've got two implicit measures that are actually telling you the exact same thing. So what's happening? You're adding data to your data model that you didn't need. Now notice inside the data model, I created an explicit measure, right? When I created that explicit measure, look what happened. All of a sudden, it appears as an option for total transactions. See this thing right here? So that's something that I can also add to my pivot table, okay? So if I go back and look at my data model, here's what you're going to get, okay? Every time I go through and create a measure, it's going to start adding those measures inside this calculation area, right? So every time I do that, it's going to add a measure. So say I go back into my pivot table again, and I go in and we'll do average. All right, so now we've got another one, right? So we did average transaction. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Average transaction number. Well, that really didn't make a lot of sense. But just for purposes of doing what we're doing here, now when I go in, hey, take a look. Look what it's doing. It's slowly starting to add those things up, okay? So the benefit of creating an explicit measure is that if you create one, it's reusable across multiple pivot tables, so they're not duplicating efforts over and over again. It also gives you a singular voice, okay? It also gives you a singular voice. Now, what you're seeing is an explicit measure, but there's another method of using DAX that I want to show you, which is called the calculated column, okay? So I can write DAX expressions up here, and it just depends on what I'm doing. Now, I'm going to go in. Well, we can just leave these for now, these expressions down at the bottom. So let's talk about calculated columns and what you can do with them and some of the basic ones. So first of all, any of the aggregation, I could go in and do a lot of that up here. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So what I want to start off with is one of the more popular DAX functions called the related function. So let's talk about DAX just a little bit. So you can write regular mathematical expressions, right? So I could go in here and I could type like 2 plus 2. So I could go in here. And I can do pretty much anything I want. So I could go equals 2 plus 2. And it just gives me 4, okay? So in many ways, like Excel, inside this calculated column, I can do basic old math. Also, though, I have the ability to do functions, right? Now, what you'll learn, and this is where I want to send you back to the book, because there are tons of DAX functions. But once you've learned one, you've kind of learned them all, as long as you learn them in categories, with the exception of the calculate DAX command, which is really a powerful tool, which is a contextual calculation, which we'll do a different video specifically on calculate. So let me show you one popular function called the related function. Let me just show you what that does first, the related function. So I don't like this column. So I'm going to jump in. And we're going to delete it. We don't like it. That was just a quick show of what that was going to do. Okay. So I'm going to go in, and let's say, for example, we wanted to know who the customer of 1482 is. Okay. Now, do we really need to do this here? We don't, but I want to show you related first because we're going to use it nested inside an if statement in just a second. So let me just show you what the related function does. The related function is the equivalent of VLOOKUP inside Excel. And remember what VLOOKUP does. It looks at data in one particular column or a specific data point, and then it looks at a data array or a table array, and it can look up where that lives inside that table and then reply with something corresponding. So in many ways, it's sort of like a dimension fact lookup. So in this particular case, let's just call this last name. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by going here, and we're going to go equals and start typing related. Okay. So when we start typing related, it actually acknowledges that there's a relationship that's happening in this table. Remember, we set that up back at the beginning? So it's acknowledging there's a relationship, and it's asking, okay, what related information do you want? So remember, fully qualified structured reference, account table, last name. So if I select related, account table, last name, it's going to look at the relationship, which is 1482. It's going to track that back to the account table, and it's going to tell me, Brunk, I think is the first one. Brunk, very good. It's going to look at 2545 and it's going to say, oh, in the account related table, that's last name of Butch. 794 is Blakely, then Hardinson, then Connors, okay? So the related function is the equivalent of VLOOKUP inside DAX of the data model when you're working inside that, okay? So that's just something really cool. Now here's what we're going to end with. We're going to get sassy with this. So I'm going to grab this table or grab this column. We're going to delete it. And let's do something else here. So let me just quickly show you. So on the account table, so you've got these membership types, bronze, silver, gold, so on and so forth. Bronze, silver, gold, okay? So what we're going to say is the benefit of having a gold membership type is that your movies are cheaper. So you pay 99 cents if you have a gold membership type versus, say, I don't know, $1.99 if you have anything else, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to add transaction total, okay? And it goes like this. If the customer has a gold membership type, they pay 99 cents. If not, they pay $1.99. So in order to make this work, we got to get really creative, right? So this would be a if statement with a VLOOKUP nested inside it if you were working inside Excel. But instead, we're going to do an if statement inside DAX, right? So we're going to start with that. And we are going to say if related account type, and we're going to close off the related, right? So just like if you were to nest a regular function. So you got to close the related equals gold, okay? So that's our logical test. If related, which is the equivalent of saying the account type, equals gold. If that's the case, they pay 99 cents. If not, they pay $1.99. We're going to close that off. And we have a calculated column, right? 99 cents, $1.99. Hey, so remember we learned about those explicit and implicit measures, right? So I'm going to guess that one of the benefits here is you're going to want to know exactly how much we've earned off of all these transactions, yeah? Probably. Well, if you do want to know that, you could go in and you could write that sum expression. So I could go in and say equals sum, and now I actually have the option of, let's go, what do we call this? Transactions total. Now, because we're on this specific worksheet, we could actually just say square bracket transactions total. I'm just taking it easy on myself by doing the whole thing and showing you that, but you have this option and this option are actually the same. I'm going to go ahead and select this one just because it makes it easier for you to see. It's just not as complicated. I'm going to click transactions total, sum transactions total, and it's thinking. I think we have it and it's just smushed. Boom, there it is. Okay, so now I can go over here. I can make this grand total. I'm going to click here. This is currency, so we're going to go 2 decimal points. And we're really doing stuff now. So now if I create a pivot table, okay, I'm going to go transactions. Notice I've got grand total as an option here. So I go actually, let's do this. Let's go, actually, yeah, let's go transaction number. So we'll go, do we want to do transactions total? Let's just grab grand total. Whoops, don't want to do that. And there you go, 9051. Boom, done, easy, okay? Keeps it simple enough. So this is a good place for us to stop. I want to go back in and I'm going to show you next video the calculate feature. which deals with contextual aggregation, contextual calculation. So, for example, what if we wanted to know the grand total of movies rented by silver membership type only, not everybody? Or what if we wanted to know silver membership type only on a certain date, right? And have that pre-calculated that shows up as an actual calculation without anything else inside Excel. We would need to use calculate to do that. It's sort of like using sum if inside Excel, but it's actually pretty complicated, and it is something that's covered really heavily on the certification exam. So I'm going to spend some time with calculate sort of on its own. So for now, go ahead and finish this part up. We'll call this chapter 2, part 2. Remember that these DAX expressions work the exact same way when you're in Power BI. So we're kind of doing chapter 2 of both books simultaneously. And with that for now, practice, practice, practice up. Shoot me an email if you have any questions, and we'll talk again soon. All right, my friends, have a good rest of your day.